Have you ever thought that an army could cross an ocean, but be stopped by a fence? June 1944, Normandy. The whole world believed the war was nearing its end. Hundreds of ships, thousands of planes, hundreds of thousands of men, a giant wave of steel rolling onto the shores of France. June 6th, history would call it D-Day, and everyone thought the road to Berlin had finally opened. But just a few weeks later, that victory was trapped among foggy, muddy fields. American tanks, the same machines that had crushed the Germans in North Africa, were now moving forward only a few meters at a time. Not because German guns were stronger, but because of something no one had ever thought about: ancient hedgerows. In Normandy, fields weren't divided by wooden fences. Farmers had piled up soil into high ridges, planting trees whose roots grew deep, forming bocage that had stood for centuries. When a Sherman tried to climb over, its nose lifted, exposing the thin belly armor. And from the other side, the Germans simply waited. One anti-tank shell, then smoke, then fire. A tanker later said, "You never saw who shot at you. You just heard the explosion and saw a flash right under the hedge." Day after day, the same scene repeated: wet ground, black smoke, the smell of burning rubber, and the grinding of tracks in the mud. The wrecks of Shermans lay tilted, smoke curling around them like mourning scarves for France. A weary sergeant muttered, "We crossed an ocean and lost to a hedge." The front froze. No one knew what to do. But among the burned-out tanks and Normandy rain, one ordinary soldier, a quiet mechanic, stood staring at the thing that had stopped an army. He had no maps, no high rank, only a small notebook, a few scraps of metal, and a mind that refused to give up. And there, amid mud and smoke, a small idea was born. So small no one noticed it at first, but one that would soon change the fields of Normandy forever. It wasn't called a green wall for nothing. These were not soft garden hedges like back home. They were natural fortresses, about 2 meters high, 3 meters thick, made of tons of earth and stone, all locked together by roots that ran 3 meters deep. They had stood there for hundreds of years, built slowly by French farmers, shovel by shovel, and now they had become perfect defenses for German soldiers. On the Allied operation maps, every little field was a strong point. Every hedgerow was a front line. American generals called Normandy a green maze, a battlefield where you couldn't see the enemy. You only knew he was somewhere behind that thick wall of roots. When a Sherman climbed up, its whole belly armor, the weakest part, was exposed. One shaped charge round was enough to blow the whole tank apart. Survivors said sometimes they didn't even hear the gun. They just felt the ground shake, and then a flash filled the cabin. Anti-tank shells, mines, machine guns, all of them were waiting on the other side. One officer wrote in his diary, "We have tanks to win battles, but the enemy has hedges to win time." Engineers tried everything: blasting, bulldozing, laying small bridges. Nothing really worked. The hedges stayed. From the air, bomber crews looked down and saw only small square fields like a chessboard, a place where every move could mean death commanders had once planned, that after D-Day, the Allies would move 30 miles a week. In reality, some days they advanced only a few hundred meters, a young soldier from Texas wrote home. "Mom, the war here isn't loud. It's just mud, rain, and hedges. Every time we climb over one of those dirt walls, we lose a tank." In the cold rain, there was the sound of metal scraping stone, tracks grinding into roots. It was like the fields of Normandy were slowly swallowing the war. One misty afternoon, at the edge of an abandoned vehicle yard, a young mechanic stood still, staring along that tangled line of roots. He didn't curse, and he didn't walk away. He just watched for a long time, then knelt down and touched the layer of earth that felt as hard as steel in his mind. Something began to spark. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Troop was not an engineer from General Motors, and he wasn't some genius sent from Washington. Before the war, he was just a truck mechanic in Newark, New Jersey, a man who could tell what was wrong with an engine simply by hearing it cough. In his old shop, the sound of wrenches, the tap of a hammer, and the smell of oil were a familiar rhythm. Cullen liked simple things: a small radio, a cheap cup of coffee, and metal that sat exactly where it belonged. He often said, "Machines are like people. Listen long enough, and you'll know when they're in pain." Taking that habit to the battlefield, he always kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket. The cover was worn, stained with oil and mud. There were no poems or diary entries inside, only rough sketches, hooks, levers, gears, angles, cutting points. Each drawing was a way he tried to solve a problem, sometimes only a stuck bolt, sometimes an entire stalled advance. Everyone in the unit knew Cullen as the quiet but busy sort. He never complained, but his eyes were always working. When others swore about another tank stuck under a hedgerow, he would simply stand and watch it, hands on his hips, frown deepening as if listening to an engine struggling to breathe. One afternoon, after the unit lost 2 more Shermans in a single hour, a private walked past, sneering, "You fixing the whole war with one wrench, Kurt?" Cullen looked up and answered quietly, in a dry, calm voice, "Maybe. Sometimes all it takes is tightening a few bolts and the whole world runs." The private laughed, thinking he was joking. Cullen did not smile. He was looking at the smoking wreck. The tank's nose was planted on the hedgerow, its belly exposed, the tracks pulled up like a defeated hand. He was no philosopher, but what he saw was simple and clear to him. Tanks die because they try to climb. It's not that they're weak. They just chose the wrong way in. That night, with rain drumming on the metal roof, Cullen sat in the hut, switched on a weak flashlight, and opened the old notebook. He drew crossed lines, then scratched them out. Drew again. Scratched again. A comrade sitting nearby asked, "What are you doing, Kurt?" "Just thinking out loud. What if we didn't climb, but went through?" "Go through the hedgerow? With what?" "With the very thing the Germans used to stop us." The answer made the man laugh aloud. "Now you're really crazy." Cullen said nothing. He turned the page and wrote 2 big words, "Cut across." Outside, rain fell on the dark, green hedges. Somewhere in the sound of mud, steel, and engines dying, an idea began to take shape. Small as a welding spark, but bright enough to light the whole battlefield. One grey, misty afternoon with rain in the air, he walked up to a Sherman that had just stopped burning. The paint was peeled away, the steel frame still hot and warped. On the ground were oil streaks and debris like broken teeth. Cullen knelt down, placed his hand on the belly armor, the place Shermans were most often badly damaged, and traced the cracks and torn metal. His hands were smudged with soot, the smell of smoke still clinging to his cap. People say he muttered, not for anyone to hear, but to steady himself. "We keep trying to climb it when we should be cutting across it." The word sounded crazy to the men nearby. Climbing was a reflex. Cutting across was something few had thought of. But in Cullen's mind, the idea was clear. Instead of forcing the tank's nose up and exposing the weak belly, you could make the nose cut in at the base, crush the roots, and split the earth to open a passage. The idea was strangely simple. Attach steel teeth to the tank's nose, points angled downward so that when the tank charged the hedgerow, the teeth would bite into the base, lever it over, tear the roots, and make a hole large enough for the tank to pass without lifting its nose. Lower, so the frontal armor still covered the crew, safer because the belly stayed protected, and faster because you would not have to wait for mines to be blown or dig out the soil meter by meter. Cullen stood up, his lips pressed together, eyes still following the cracks in the metal. Back in the hut, he pulled out an old chair, lit a dim oil lamp, and opened his small notebook. His hands trembled, whether from cold or emotion he could not tell, as he quickly sketched a V shape, marked 4 tip points, noted the angle, and wrote down rough lengths and spacing of the teeth. In the margin he wrote, height, low enough to bite roots, angle 15 degrees down. Rough numbers, but the start of a design. When his mates came by, they joked, "Are you making a toy, Kurt?" Cullen only frowned and said plainly, "Not a toy. If this works, the men inside won't burn." A simple sentence, but his eyes were fierce. In his head, the next steps were clear. Find a broken Sherman, take some steel from the Czech hedgehogs on the beach, cut, weld, and test. He would need a good welder, a well-lit place, and an officer brave enough to allow the trial. He muttered one more line, almost to himself. "If nobody gives permission, I'll make it and show them." That night, with rain drumming on the roof, he lay awake on a thin bed, the V-shape and 15 degrees spinning in his head. Sometimes he sat up, added a line, erased a note. The idea grew beyond a sketch. It became a small plan, then a quiet promise. Try it, even if only once. Before dawn the next morning, Cullen took his notebook, a welding mask, and a few old tools to a friend in the welding crew. He did not brag. He only said, "I have an idea, want to try?" The welder frowned when he saw the drawing. Then his eyes lit up. "If it will bite, then we have an answer." The two made a quick list. Where to get steel, where to weld, and especially which Sherman to use as a model. That was the moment the vague idea became a mission. When the first steel bars were bolted on, the sound of clamps and the welder's torch came like a new heartbeat for the front. The story that a mechanic from Newark sat in mud and rain, looked at torn armor, and muttered a strange idea, later told around the huts, became a simple, clear flash of insight, where a man who listened to metal knew more than any book. Captain Robert Lane was bent over the map table, eyes red from late hours when Cullen stepped in. On the paper were distances, arrows, village names, and exclamation marks beside the slow stretches of advance. That day Lane had just received word of 2 more Shermans burned at a new junction. The tension in the room was tight as a drawn wire. Cullen set his notebook on the table, opened to the page with the rough V sketch, and pointed to his penciled notes. Depth of nose, spacing of teeth, 15-degree angle. His voice was low, but cut through the sound of rain outside the hut. "Sir," he said plainly, "we're losing tanks to the ground. Let me make the ground lose." Lane frowned, rested his hands on the map, and examined the lines. He shook his head a little and looked at Cullen as if viewing a strange drawing from a restless child. "You want to weld scrap metal from the beach onto our tanks and drive them into the hedgerows?" he asked, half mocking, half serious. "Yes, sir. At full speed." Cullen replied shortly, with no fancy words. In that answer were both promise and challenge, as if he already saw the result in his mind. Silence hung for a moment, the only sound the rustle of paper. Lane rubbed his temples slowly, as if easing fatigue. "You've got 48 hours, 1 tank. If it fails, you explain it yourself." His tone was stern and a little sarcastic. A chance, but a gamble. A failure would have real consequences for both men. Cullen smiled, no longer hesitant. "And if it works, you'll be the one explaining." The joke carried a quiet faith everyone could feel. They shook hands, a short, uneasy pact between a soldier and his commander under the pressure of war. Lane looked around the hut and saw a few welders huddled, exchanging glances that hinted they understood the plan. He added, softer now, "You can use the resources, but report every step. I don't want anyone hurt for something we can try in the test yard." Cullen nodded. "I'll need an acetylene torch, 2 welders, and permission to take a damaged Sherman. I'll bring you results." Lane glanced at the equipment list. 48 hours, that's it. He thought, if it works, it will be a simple, effective fix. If it fails, they could be punished for recklessness. But he also knew sometimes the most useful thing is not theory or grand plans, but a rough test at the right moment. As Cullen left, men in the hut whispered. One jeered, "Let's give the Sherman a drill bit while we're at it," while others fell silent, curious. Everyone felt a thin current of hope, mixed with fear running through the camp. That night, Cullen returned with his list, his face set like a man about to fight another battle. He opened his notebook, redrew some lines more clearly, set times and tasks. When the crew gathered around the wooden table, a soft laugh rose and someone murmured, "If you pull it off, Kurt, we'll have more friends left to drink beer with on the other side of victory." Cullen answered, "That's the point." Then he fell quiet, not from doubt this time, but from focus. In his mind, the sketch had become a named task with a deadline, and under the Normandy night, amid rain, mud, and the rumble of engines, a small plan began to move. They went to Omaha Beach, the same beach that had burned with fire on the first day of the landings, to search for scrap along the shore. Between broken iron stakes and ship fragments washed up by the tide, lay hundreds of Czech hedgehogs, the obstacles the Germans had built to tear open the bellies of landing craft. Now, the same steel that had once stopped Americans would be used to clear the path for them to move forward. The rain still fell softly, mud clung to their knees, wind from the sea carried the smell of salt and smoke. Cullen pointed. "Take these beams, the cross-shaped ones, thick steel, cut them diagonally, about 3 feet each tip." Beside him was Sergeant Alvarez from Texas, sun-browned, fast with a torch, faster with a curse. They rigged a torn canvas as a roof, set the welder and gas tank underneath, and laid out the rusted beams. In the pale light, the welding torch flashed like small lightning, hissing and sparking. Alvarez squinted, his voice half lost in the rain. "Kurt, you sure about this? If this thing snaps, we'll be famous in the wrong way." Cullen didn't look up. "And if it doesn't, maybe we get home sooner." Sparks flew, orange light against grey air, as rain hissed on hot metal, steam curling into the fog. The smell of burning iron, machine oil, and sea salt blended into the scent of war, harsh, heavy, yet strangely full of hope. All night they barely spoke. Only the generator's rumble, the pop and crack of welding, and the flicker of light on their faces. A young soldier brought coffee, stood watching, then shook his head. "God, you two look like you're making helmets for the devil." Cullen smiled faintly. "If the devil's behind those hedges, then yeah, we are." By dawn, 4 massive steel teeth were finished. They cooled slowly, turning dark grey, cold as stone. When bolted onto the nose of the Sherman, the tank looked completely different. Awkward, brutal, like some armoured beast ready to smash through anything in its path. Soldiers passing by stopped to stare. One whistled. "What the hell is that? Your tank's got teeth now?" Cullen shrugged, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "Call it breakfast for the hedgerows." The group burst out laughing, though their eyes stayed fixed on the steel nose, waiting to see if that breakfast could really eat through the walls of Normandy. One soldier scratched his head. "If this thing works, Kurt, you'll put the engineers back home out of business." "I don't want to take anyone's job," Cullen said evenly. "I just want the men in these tanks to stay alive." They packed up the tools. The clouds finally broke, letting a silver band of light spill over the beach. The torch went quiet, replaced by the sound of cooling metal, sharp, solid, like the resolve of the man who made it. Cullen stood before the Sherman, hands black with soot, the reflection of the steel glinting in his eyes. It was no longer just a tank. It was a challenge, aimed straight at the green walls of Normandy. They chose the thickest hedgerow they could find, the kind where roots tangled like the bones of an old giant, and the soil was so dark and heavy it looked like wet iron. Cullen wanted to go big. If it fails, he joked, let's make it fail properly. The others laughed, half from nerves, half from fear. The Sherman stood waiting in the morning mist, its new steel teeth glinting under a thin coat of oil, like some strange animal lowering its head before a charge. Around it gathered a handful of officers, a few tankers, and Captain Lane himself, standing a few yards away, his boots sinking into the mud. No one spoke. Everyone understood what was about to happen. It was either foolishness or the beginning of something extraordinary. Lane adjusted his helmet and raised his hand. "All right, Sergeant," he called. "Let's see that hole you promised me." Cullen answered with a simple nod, climbed into the tank, and shut the hatch. The engine roared to life. The sound of grinding tracks rolled through the field, the air filled with the smell of burnt fuel and the faint tang of metal still warm from welding. The Sherman began to move, 10 kilometers an hour, 15, then 20. The sound deepened, heavy and low, like drums beating from under the earth. Everyone held their breath. Then, crash! The tank's nose slammed straight into the base of the hedgerow. Earth and stones exploded upward like a blast wave. Branches snapped, and for a moment the entire vehicle disappeared into a cloud of dirt. A second later, with a long guttural roar, it burst through the other side. Intact, powerful, and unstoppable. Behind it was a gaping hole wide enough for a column of tanks to pass through. Roots, soil, and clumps of grass flew into the air and rained down on the men's helmets and wet boots. Silence. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then someone whistled. Another laughed. And suddenly the whole field erupted in cheers and shouts. Captain Lane threw back his head, laughing hoarsely. "Good God! It bites!" Cullen jumped down from the tank, mud splattering up to his knees, his face streaked with soot and rain, but his grin was bright, like that of a boy who had just made something come alive. "Sir," he said, "that's the new doorway into France." The air filled with noise, laughter, cheers, the clanging of helmets against armor. Some of the men ran to touch the steel nose, half in disbelief, as if they needed to feel the proof with their own hands. The official report that went up the chain of command was dry and short. Field modification allows tank to penetrate hedgerows while maintaining frontal armor protection. But in the camp, the name spread faster than any report. They called it the Rhino, not because it was pretty, but because it bit, rammed, and never stopped. That night, as the men sat together eating their rations, someone lifted a tin of coffee and joked, "Here's to you, Kurt. Thanks to your Rhino, we've still got jobs tomorrow." Cullen only smiled. He didn't need to say anything. He knew what they all knew now, that the hedges of Normandy weren't walls anymore. They were just debris waiting to be crushed under steel tracks. 2 days later, near Saint-Lô, the rain still fell fine as mist, the kind that soaked through everything without making a sound. Visibility was only a few dozen meters. The entire unit was readying for the assault across a field split by the thickest hedgerow in the region. The ground was mushy, tree leaves clung to the steel tracks, and the air itself felt tight, like a drawn wire about to snap. Cullen sat on the turret, headset pressed to his ear, eyes fixed on the wall of green ahead. His voice came slow, calm, steady. The voice of a mechanic, back in his workshop, not a soldier at war. 20-degree angle. He said quietly, "Let the teeth bite in." The driver nodded, pushed the throttle. The engine roared to life, a deep thunder rolling through the mud. The Rhino moved, heavy, determined, its tracks chewing through the soaked ground. In an instant, the steel teeth struck the hedge. Crack! The mass of dirt and roots ripped apart, flung into the air like a giant hand had torn it open. The Sherman broke through, shattering the green wall, its gun turret swung forward, ready. The first shell fired before the German soldiers could even lift their heads from the bunkers. The blast echoed through the rain, followed by another, and another. One by one, the other Shermans followed, bursting through the hedgerows in a chain of power and thunder. For the first time, the American tanks weren't slowed, weren't trapped. They were free. Over the radio came shouts mixed with static, voices rising with disbelief and excitement. "Rhino's through! Rhino's through!" Behind the tanks, the infantry poured through the smoking gaps. For the first time since D-Day, they didn't crawl over the hedges or climb through the mud. They walked straight ahead, rifles ready, boots firm on open ground. When the smoke cleared, Captain Lane stood in the middle of the field, looking along the torn, muddy path that had once been a solid wall of earth and roots. He exhaled, half smiling, half shaking his head. "About time, sir. No more fighting the hedges." The wind swept across the field, carrying the smell of freshly turned soil, the smell of victory beginning to take shape. And on that wet, scarred ground, the tank tracks stretched out in a long, straight line, the first road ever cut through the heart of Normandy. News about the hedge cutter spread faster than the tanks themselves. It moved from unit to unit, from command post to command post, even to the makeshift cafes dug into the earth behind the lines. From grease-stained Sherman crews to engineers hunched over maps, everyone wanted those iron teeth. Short, excited reports began to appear. Experimental device at St. Lo successful. Recommend immediate replication. From the front lines to the rear, all of Normandy turned into one enormous workshop. Repair crews scoured the beaches for scrap, the rusting Czech hedgehogs, the broken iron stakes, the jagged metal that had once torn apart the landing craft at Omaha. Now the things that had stopped them were becoming the tools that would carry them forward. A staff officer later recalled, still sounding amazed, "Just one night before, we were fighting against those obstacles. The next night, we were cutting them apart for parts." Engineer camps glowed through the night. Under rain-soaked tarps, welding sparks danced like fireflies in a storm. Generators growled, hammers clanged, heated metal shrieked as it bent under the blows. The air was thick with the smell of burning steel, spilled oil, and hastily brewed coffee. The unmistakable scent of war's backstage industry. And young welder lifted his helmet, grinning through the smoke. "We're not fighting anymore," he said. "We're farming, ploughing all of France." Laughter broke out around the tent, but under the laughter there was relief, even pride. They all knew. Every spark that flew here might save a man out there. Night after night, the heaps of rust turned into shining silver teeth. Every few hours a jeep would arrive, hauling more scrap, or a smudged drawing sketched on oiled paper, sometimes just a note scribbled in pencil. "Try this weld. Bites better at the roots." By the end of the week, the whole battalion was rolling again, every Sherman's nose glinting with 4 polished steel tusks. No one waited for orders from factories. No paperwork was sent. In war, necessity was the permission. Americans never just stick to one version. As soon as the first Rhinos smashed through the hedgerows, mechanics all across the front started making their own at a field workshop near St. Lo. One tank crew welded on a 5th tooth in the middle so it would cut deeper. Somewhere else, another team sharpened the teeth like plow blades, and they laughed out loud when they heard the steel screeching through dirt. At Cormont, a Texas sergeant said, "Soil's too soft here. We bent the teeth down 10 degrees so it goes straight into the roots." Every little idea like that got scribbled down in pencil on an oily sheet of paper with a short line at the bottom. "Extra tooth improves cutting. Recommend for wider use." The whole army turned into a giant workshop without anyone ordering it from above. Anywhere there were mechanics and a welding torch, there was a new version. A young lieutenant even called back to his old unit in England, still excited. "Tell Jersey we added another tooth. It cuts clean now." When that news reached Curtis Cullen a few days later, people said he just smiled softly and said, "I gave you the idea. Making it smarter. That's your part." Then he bent over his old sketch again and added a few more lines, like he still wasn't done improving it. That spirit, try it now, scale it if it works, was the heartbeat of the US Army at that moment. No perfectionism, no fear of being wrong, no waiting for approval. A good idea could be born in a welding tent, tested in the afternoon, and sent into battle the next morning. Within weeks, from Saint-Lô to Caen, along every muddy road, Shermans with Rhino teeth started showing up, lines of tanks rolled forward, each one with 4 or 5 sharp steel prongs jutting out, shining wet in the Normandy rain. The ground of Normandy, the thing that had held back an entire army, couldn't stop anyone anymore, one officer wrote in his journal. "I don't know who thought of it first. All I know is, right now, all of France can hear those rhinos chewing through the hedges." While the Americans were laughing beside the torn earth walls, on the other side of the line, the Germans were honestly confused. They had been used to the old rhythm. The moment they saw the nose of an American tank lift over a hedgerow, they fired a Panzerfaust would punch through the thin belly armor like a knife through butter. Then suddenly, that rule didn't work anymore. At a German command dugout near Saint-Lô, a reconnaissance officer wrote in his report to the division, "Enemy armored vehicles now cross hedgerows without exposing their underside. Our anti-tank effectiveness has dropped sharply. Cause unknown." After that, all kinds of theories appeared. Some said the Americans were using a new model of tank. Others said they were pushing bulldozers ahead to clear the way. A few field engineers even suggested, the enemy is using some kind of explosive to lift the soil, something that didn't exist at all. German units began to react in their own way. They buried mines deeper. They built fake hedgerows. They placed guns at an angle to fire into the sides. But it didn't work. American tanks still came through, slicing in like a blade through wet earth, and they fired before the Germans could adjust their positions. A German prisoner captured near Carentan later said, during Allied interrogation, "We thought the Americans had a new tank. We didn't know it was just one mechanic." That line, short and a bit bitter, was written down in the report. A US engineer read it and smiled. Sometimes one little weld breaks a whole doctrine. And it was true. In war, people often think victory belongs to generals or to big, perfect plans. But sometimes one welding spark in a rainy night is enough to change the direction of a whole campaign. After the Rhino appeared, German reports became shorter, colder, more tired. Defensive line breached at several points. Enemy armor advancing faster than forecast. Defensive situation unstable. That was the moment, on the war maps, when Normandy began to melt. The hedgerows that once cut the fields into a green maze were now only broken brown lines, stretching for miles, all pointing toward Paris. By the end of July 1944, when the Normandy rain finally began to ease, General Omar Bradley gave the order to launch Operation Cobra, the decisive punch to break the stalemate that had held the front for almost 2 months. The plan was simple but bold. Open a corridor through the German line so the entire US force could spill out onto the Brittany Plain. And at the very front, ahead of the artillery, were the Shermans with Rhino teeth. In the dim morning light, those grey steel spikes pushed out of the mist. Engines roared, tracks bit into the soft ground. When the artillery barrage stopped, dozens of rhinos moved at once, tearing through the hedgerows that had killed so many tanks before. A young lieutenant from the 2nd Armoured called over the radio, his voice mixed with static. "We're out of the maze. It's open ground ahead." That short line moved through the whole network like one long exhale. After nearly 2 months trapped in small, muddy fields cut up by hedges, American troops finally saw open country. That day, Bradley's First Army advanced farther than it had in the previous 3 weeks combined. They punched through the German line, rolled over pockets of resistance, and reached the open areas where tanks could finally fight. The way they were built to fight, the maps, which had been creeping forward inch by inch, suddenly had long arrows stretching for miles. Later, historians would write in short but heavy sentences, Cullen's hedge cutter likely shortened the Normandy campaign by several weeks and saved thousands of lives. But if anyone had asked the man who made it, Curtis Cullen would probably just have shrugged and smiled a little. It worked. For him, war wasn't the place for big speeches, a tool that did its job. That was reward enough. That afternoon, as the sun set over smoky French fields, Bradley stood over a worn map, tracing the arrows reaching out from Saint-Lô. He said quietly, almost to himself, "We just broke out of Normandy." And he was right. In that moment, with thousands of tracks grinding across French soil and Rhino teeth glinting in the sunset, the war in the West changed direction. After the first Rhinos proved their strength, the gears of the American war machine began turning faster than ever. Field repair depots reported full capacity. Workshops in England received a new directive. Equip all Sherman tanks bound for the continent with standard hedge-cutting devices. And so, in the noisy factories of Southampton, Portsmouth, and Bristol, steel burned bright again. Workers and army mechanics welded the first mass-produced Rhino teeth onto the tanks. On every Sherman's nose, 4 V-shaped blades jutted forward like the jaws of an iron beast. A sign hung above one factory gate, "Welcome to the zoo." Everyone laughed when they passed it, but behind the laughter was a quiet pride. They knew what they were building wasn't just steel, it was the road home for men still fighting across the channel. A young welder wrote to his mother, his hands still greasy with oil. "Mom, we're giving the tanks mouths, and they're hungry. Every day they eat a few hedgerows." In photographs taken at the Southampton docks, long lines of Shermans rolled towards the ships, waiting to cross the sea. Everyone bore the same edition. Hedge cutter, Mark I. On some turrets, someone had chalked the words, "Rhino Express." Even the British started copying it. They called it Cullen's Claw, the Claw of Cullen. In British armoured units, stories spread about the quiet mechanic from the States. One British officer remarked, "Perhaps the simplest device we've seen, yet it's changed the very ground we fight on." And then, for the first time since D-Day, the tanks began moving faster than their supply trucks. The logistics crews had to scramble to build new routes just to keep up. The maps, once covered in short, hesitant arrows, now stretched with long, sweeping lines. Proof that the Allies had truly broken free of Normandy. Years later, one tanker would recall, "That day I looked through the periscope and saw open fields ahead. No more hedges, just a wide road and dust rising behind us." When the Rhinos began clearing the way for whole army groups, the commanders grew bolder and pushed the advance faster. The old Norman hedgerows that had once been natural fortresses were now just torn strips of earth. But behind every broken wall, enemy guns still waited. Cullen watched damaged tanks being towed back, smoke still curling from their hulls. Bent steel, broken tracks, the burnt rubber smell hanging in the air. The kind of smell only people at the front really recognize. An army chaplain walked by, his uniform muddy, and stopped beside him. "You built this thing to save them," he said quietly. Cullen looked at a Sherman being dragged away, a shell hole punched clean through its turret. He answered softly, almost to himself, "Maybe I only made it faster." The chaplain was silent for a moment, then said, "You didn't start the war. You just made it less bad." Cullen didn't reply. He only nodded, eyes fading into the smoky evening. He understood what the chaplain meant, but the weight was still there. Because every time a rhino broke through a hedge and fired through, he thought of the men on the other side, soldiers his own age, just as scared as he was. That night, when the others were asleep, Cullen stayed by the engineer tent, watching the welding flashes blink in the distance at other field workshops. He lit a cigarette and drew in deeply, the smoke folding into the darkness. Maybe he really had made it less bad. Or maybe, like he'd said, he had only made the killing happen faster. No one could say for sure. There was only the steady Normandy rain on the tent roof, like a clock counting down toward the end of the war. News of the Rhino spread like wildfire. Behind the front lines, newspapers painted the image of an ordinary man doing something extraordinary, and soon headlines appeared everywhere. The mechanic who outsmarted Hitler's hedges. One morning, Cullen found himself surrounded by a crowd of reporters. Flashbulbs popped like fireflies, microphones jutted toward him like a forest of antennae, cameras clicked, voices overlapped. "How did you do it? Where did the idea come from? Who gave you permission?" But when someone asked how he had come up with it, the answer everyone remembered wasn't a long, technical explanation. It was a smile, and a simple sentence. "I saw a problem. I had a torch, so I fixed it." The words were quiet, but they cut through the noise. There was something so genuine in them that the crowd fell still for a moment. The image of him, rough hands, oil-stained coveralls, eyes bright with thought, became its own kind of symbol. Not of genius, but of someone who simply saw what needed doing and did it. A week later, in a warmer command tent, General Omar Bradley stepped forward and shook his hand firmly. The general didn't speak in grand phrases. His voice was calm but heavy with meaning. "You did something that a lot of engineers in Washington couldn't do." Cullen stood there, listening, then answered quietly, more to his conscience than to the general. "Sir, I just wanted fewer tanks to burn." There was another silence. Bradley looked at those smoke-darkened hands, then out the window at a Sherman parked nearby, its steel teeth glinting under the fading light. He nodded, as if acknowledging a simple truth. In war, sometimes the most effective solutions don't come from laboratories or polished desks, but from the hands of people who know how to bring machines back to life. The press praised him later. His photo appeared in newspapers. Women back home read about him with pride. But in the letters that came from the front, from the men who'd survived because of the Rhino, the most meaningful thanks was always the same. "Thanks, Kurt. You gave us a way home." And that, perhaps, was the reward Cullen valued most. Not a title, not a medal, but something far more real. Fewer tanks burned, fewer friends lost. By mid-August, the bocage was no longer an obstacle. Allied forces were pouring across France. A French farmer stood by the roadside, watching the endless column of vehicles roll past, and said softly, "The walls our fathers built have finally fallen." The German defense, once anchored in the thick, twisting terrain, suddenly had nothing left to cling to in the open fields. In his report, Eisenhower noted that the new cutting devices had played a major role in sustaining the pace of the advance. Curtis Cullen's name appeared only once, a small line in a long document. For him, that was enough. When the war was over, he went back to New Jersey, reopened a small garage, and went back to fixing trucks. If anyone asked about the medal on the shelf, he just waved it off. Just something from the old job. A few years later, someone from a museum wrote and asked him to describe the original design. In the short letter Cullen sent back, he ended with, "I wasn't trying to do anything clever. I just didn't want to see tanks burn anymore." The old heaviness in his chest had softened by then. He understood that what he built had saved more lives than it ever harmed. Today, Those steel teeth rest quietly behind glass, one in Normandy, another in Fort Benning. Visitors still reach out to touch the rusted surface, and for a brief moment, it's as if they can hear 1944 again. The rain hitting canvas tents, the hiss of a welder's torch in the cold wind, and the roar of tanks climbing out of the mud. Historians now call it one of the most effective field innovations of World War II. But to the men who rode inside those Shermans, it was simpler than that. It was the road home. Not every great change begins in a conference room or a laboratory. Many begin in muddy field workshops lit by sparks, with hands that refuse to give up, and a mind that dares to ask, "What if we try?" Curtis Cullen's story isn't about medals or glory. It's about the courage of a mechanic, a man who commanded no army, but solved a problem that had stopped one. He proved that sometimes creativity can be as powerful as firepower. If anyone had called him a hero, he probably would have smiled and said, "Heroes are the ones who fight, I just welded." But that single spark from his welding torch still burns, in every road that was opened, in every wall that was torn down, in every life that made it past those hedges and survived. And if this story warms you a little, remember, it all began with one ordinary man who simply refused to accept the words, "Can't be done." There are many more stories like his, about quiet hands that made loud victories possible. Subscribe to the channel to hear more true stories of ingenuity, courage, and the people who helped shape victory with nothing more than the right idea at the right time.